Good evening and welcome to the 12th edition of Tata Literature Live, the Mumbai Lit Fest, co-sponsored by Tata Projects and Tata Steel and powered by Godrej. This session is sponsored by Prime Securities. Coming up now, the session where we are most excited to present the book launch of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's new book titled Pride, Prejudice and Punditry. Now, Dr. Tharoor needs no introduction, of course, but did you know that the politician, writer, and former international diplomat who has also been serving as the Member of Parliament Lok Sabha, began writing at the age of 6 and had his first story appear in print at the age of 10. Now, I can't wait to find out more as he gets into discussion today. But before that, it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Shashi Tharoor to the screen and Festival Director Amy Fernandez to please do us the honor by launching Dr. Shashi Tharoor's new book. Over to you, Amy.
Here we go. We launch the book. So congratulations, Shashi, on your new book.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Shashi Tharoor has been a friend of Literature Live from the time it began, which was 12 years ago. And it's my privilege to be here at the launch today. Now, apart from the book and the fabulous title, I'm quite intrigued and I enjoy the essential Shashi Tharoor as a strapline. For those of you who want to know what or who or which exactly is the essential Shashi Tharoor? Is he author? Is he a poet? Is he essayist? Is he a cricket enthusiast like the book shows? You're going to find out when you read the book, and I recommend that you do.
Thank you so much, Amy Fernandez, for that. And now on to the session titled Scripturient. Now, I'll be frank, I had to look up the meaning of that word. And it means, according to forreadingaddicts.co.uk, a violent desire to write. Now, to find out Dr. Tharoor's reasons for his violent desire to write, joining the discussion today is author and journalist Keshava Guha, whose first novel, Accidental Magic, was published in 2019. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let the discussion begin. Over to you, Dr. Keshava.
Thank you, Ratnabali. Thank you, Amy. It's always a treat to be able to talk to Shashi. I'm sure you're sick of being told that you need no introduction. But one of the things that this book makes clear is that Shashi Tharoor is quite possibly both the most prolific as well as the most wide-ranging Indian prose writer, certainly Indian English language prose writer of our time. And the book, covers a range of it. And we'll touch on a few aspects of that. But one thing that really struck me, Shashi, going through it, was that, like many other things, your career as a writer seems to have a before and after 2014 shape to it. Before 2014 and certainly before 2009, when you returned to India, you were best known, I think, for a book only half ironically called The Great Indian Novel, and also for for a really influential and best-selling popular history of India's first 50 years, from midnight to the millennium. But you also wrote about, wrote a novel about film. You wrote extensively about your love of cricket. But after 2009, and between 2009 and 2014, I think you had to largely take a break from writing, occupied by ministerial office and that sort of thing. Since 2014, though, you seem to have really focused on one aspect of your life as a writer, which is books on India's past, present, and future. A book of historical argument, and then a series of reflections on what it means to be Indian, what it ought to mean to be Indian, India's place in the world, and all of that. So, could it be said perhaps that its writing is now less a matter of passion and more a matter of obligation and duty?
No, that's unfair, Keshav. These are things that, frankly, I've always thought about and cared about. And once I stepped into the domain of politics and public life, I realized that perhaps the most valuable contribution I could make in politics is not through any position I might be able to hold, but rather through the ideas I could contribute to the public conversation that ought to matter. I mean, I do see politics fundamentally, and I agree many of my colleagues don't, fundamentally as a battle of ideas. And I feel that if the ideas are right, and we start off with values and principles, then the votes could follow. I shouldn't say will follow, because they haven't always, but therefore I took it upon myself, and it's very perceptive of you to notice. I wouldn't say just 2014, because my first foray into talking about contemporary India really began with Pax Indica in 2012. I had an interregnum between two ministerships when I had the opportunity to reflect on India's foreign policy, and I wrote about that. And then, of course, as you rightly said, everything from Mr. Modi's ascent, India Shastra, then you had a book that quite bluntly analyzed the first term of the Prime Minister, the paradoxical Prime Minister, and then you had a book about history, which you've mentioned, an era of darkness, about the British Empire and what that meant for who we were today. And now most recently a book on nationalism and patriotism and what that means. And that's the battle of belonging. And in between, largely because the BJP, I thought, had put the issue front and center and I needed to address it, a book called Why I'm a Hindu. And when people thought that was politically opportunist, I pointed out that, in fact, what I'd spent 400 pages explaining in Why I'm a Hindu was actually prefigured in a couple of paragraphs of India from Midnight to the Millennium 25 years earlier. So it's not that these are completely new thoughts that have come up merely because I'm defining myself as a Hindu in opposition to the BJP's understanding of Hinduism, but rather that I have always defined myself this way, but took it for granted that mine was not a particularly complicated position that needed defending. It's just that the BJP has made it so. By putting Hindutva front and center, it has created an idea of Indianness and of Hindu-ness. Hindutva literally means Hindu-ness, after all, that I felt needed to be contested. So all of these books, you're quite right, have been specifically contributions to the national conversation by somebody who happens to be in public life. And I think in many ways that would be perhaps my most lasting political legacy.
I'm very struck by your referring to the fact that many of your colleagues don't see it the same way, politics being ultimately about ideas, because what I think really comes through in this book is that you are a kind of 21st century participant in a much older tradition. After all, Nehru is the obvious example, but our founding fathers, if we might use appropriate that American expression, most of them wrote books. And they really believed in the power of ideas and the power of the written word as a way to transmit those ideas to the country. And you can't think of the freedom struggle without the books and the newspaper articles, etc. That Gandhi, Tilak, Lajpat Rai, Vivekananda, so on and so forth, wrote. So, but in this book, and I think one of the things that really struck me was an unusual quality among a politician, which is your candor in some of these articles and pieces. So there's one called The Life of an MP, where you very bluntly say, I see politics as about being ideas and about policies, but my experience of voters is that they very often don't see it that way. They want to help me to help them get a job or get them into college or get a hospital bed for their mother or so on and so forth. But I want to point to something else, which is a piece that you wrote called The Convictions of the Indian National Congress. And in it you say, we need to reaffirm our belief in these values, the values that you've enumerated, and keep reiterating them at every opportunity. This means that our top leaders need to eschew their habitual reticence and speak out more often and more loudly. So what I can't quite understand is why more of your colleagues or leaders don't follow your example, because I think what your example shows is that actually there can be political benefits. Your national profile can increase, and your ideas can actually have greater resonance if you write books. I've never understood. I think if the Congress president or vice president were to write a book with the E.M. Forster title of What I Believe, I think that every publisher would be after them, and the whole country would want to know what they had to say. What do you think is stopping your colleagues from following your example?
Well, I would say that they have not prioritized this form of expression as I have, in the sense that for them, quite objectively, what I'm doing and your lauding will actually only reach a small, highly literate elite. I mean, I'm not even reaching necessarily a majority of book reading Indians,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
a majority of book reading Indians may not read a book about ideas of politics. They might read novels, they might read rom-coms, they might read thrillers far more easily than they would want to read one of my books. And so, from a politician's point of view, numbers matter because numbers are what determine outcomes in elections.
yeah,
And therefore, the fact that I am sort of plowing a field which very few numbers would actually show up to plant anything in,
yeah,
or to pick any flowers in, if you want to extend the metaphor,
yeah,
makes it less worth the time for most political leaders. I'm not saying that judgmentally. I think I fully
yeah,
understand their calculation.
yeah,
But I think, there needs to be the occasional Shashi Tharoor coming
yeah,
along and saying ideas matter, and let me describe them. Also, frankly, for nothing else, as an amateur historian, let me say that it'll be of some value perhaps decades down the road when historians want to look back on what were the debates that animated
yeah.
the political space. At least they have a set of ideas by a serving politician, in addition to the excellent commentaries and op-eds they'll dig up from the newspapers and analyses of outsiders of this time.
Yeah. No, it's just surprising because I think that your example shows that that view is wrong. That even if the book might sell, I mean, your David Devida says in the introduction that An Era of Darkness sold 250,000 copies in hardback. I think what you're saying is that in political terms, that's a small number. But
Yeah.
I think that Gandhi and Nehru wrote books at a time when many fewer Indians could read. But we've seen that the value of those books in disseminating their ideas. But I don't want to only talk about this aspect of you. I thought let's go back to the beginning. One of my favorite pieces in this book is a celebration of a publication called Junior Statesman, where I think you had some of your first published pieces. And I grew up, hearing from my parents who had grown up reading Junior Statesman. And I wonder if you could speak to that time, because you say this was a time where books were the only distraction or form of entertainment there were.
That's right. And the thing is that when Junior Statesman was established and then, of course, became JS, it was actually, it was done, to be very honest, as an experiment in having something for children, but rapidly established a niche for itself amongst teenagers in late 60s India. And I think it's extraordinarily interesting that as a teenage magazine, it only lasted 10 years, 67 to 77. So it's literally kids who turned about 12 or 13 in 67 and grew out of teenagers who have the most affectionate memories. It's sort of one generation. But JS, as it quickly became, I mean, even officially dropped the term to become JS. This is something which captured a sort of heady spirit of the day. Remember, the 60s in the West were the era of Carnaby Street and the Beatles and all sorts of the miniskirt and revolution there. That wasn't the revolution we were having. But this magazine, in its freewheeling and path-breaking way, has been described as sort of inventing the Indian teenager. At the very least, it revolutionized young urban Indian sensibilities during this decade. And people who wrote for JS, like Jag Suraya, better known in the Times of India since, said JS wasn't just a magazine, it was a happening. That is, I think, what made it so interesting. And I wrote fiction there, I wrote journalism there, I was sent off to do investigative pieces. I did lots of stuff for them, entirely while also being a full-time high school and college student. And though soon after I went off to the US to do my graduate studies and my doctorate, JS also folded back in India. I must say that no one associated with it, either as a writer or a reader, will forget it.
So another thing that comes through in this collection is how wrong I think there's a certain perception of you, and it's difficult to think of a case where the caricature of a writer is so different from the reality. But there's a certain perception of you as being a specialist in what the Americans call $10 words. And I think what really comes through as you see the range of your work is that actually your genius is for more, in a sense, the George Orwell tradition of clear, elegant but accessible communication. And you actually it's very rare that you tend to to use a word that would send the reader to the dictionary.
Thank you for saying that, Keshava, because honestly, I find it extremely irritating that as recently as this Diwali, for example, somebody made up an entire sentence of gibberish using lots of long words.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
said, Shashi Tharoor sent me a Diwali greeting. And about 15 of my friends forwarded to me saying, whom did you send this to? And I said, I didn't write this nonsense. But unfortunately, once the caricature sticks, you're saddled with it. And that's what's happened. And the irony is that it's entirely the result of one blessed tweet, which I didn't think, when a particularly egregious and offensive, I might add, television journalist essentially took to the air to broadcast a whole series of lies about me. And I promptly let fly with a tweet saying this is a farrago of misrepresentations and outright lies. It's merely the word farrago, and I went on to say by a showman masquerading as a journalist, so to a lesser degree the word masquerading. These two somehow convinced people that I was somebody who used obscure and difficult words. I'd been using farrago since my debating days at St. Stephen's, as my contemporary would remember. So I find it quite bizarre that this became, for a day, the most searched word in the Oxford English Dictionary, and OED even tweeted in puzzlement as to why suddenly 1 million people had been looking it up. And then it got stuck. People started deciding that I was this, as you said, the sesquipedalian user of obscure terminology. And I'm not, because I write to be read. And if I kept writing words that no one would understand, once in a while I would shall we say, misjudge what people do understand. And I would use words that perhaps I was wrong to assume the majority would understand. But for the most part, the only occasions in which I use unwieldy words is jokingly, as when I tweeted that my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, was more than just a 500-page exercise in floxinosi nihilipilification. I mean, that was a deliberate joke. It was meant to draw attention to the book, and it succeeded in doing that. But the result I had was poor little toddlers practically being wheeled out by their parents to recite floxinosi nihilipilification beautifully to their cameras, or even to me if they came across me in person anywhere. And I guess I'm stuck with that.
But I wonder if you would agree nonetheless that you and perhaps other writers of your generation, people from similar backgrounds, such as Stephanian writers and so on and so forth, have operated in a kind of literary British English, even if it's very clear and accessible and the words are not difficult. And what we haven't had in India is a kind of literary Indian English. I mean, thinking of the contrast with the America, where Saul Bellow or Philip Roth or people like this were very comfortable working in an American idiom. And it seems to be in India that if you're a serious writer, you can't work in an Indian idiom. And the Indian idiom is left to sort of commercial fiction and romance and that kind of thing. But I suppose in your case, it would be, you can't fake an Indian idiom. I suppose you're speaking the English that you always have.
That's it. And, I learned English from Indian teachers, but whose standards were fairly rigorous. And in places and environments where English was the principal language of communication, that simply was the practice in that era. I mean, certainly when I went to Campion School, Bombay in the 60s, even using Hindi words in English sentences was simply not common. I really improved my Hindi only when I got to St. Stephen's. And there was sort of Hindi in the streets and Hindi in the dhabas and Hindi and you went off to watch movies and so on and so forth. But I did grow up learning a correct English. Then as a child of Malayali parents growing up in Bombay and then Calcutta and then going to college in Delhi, English is the language I had in common with my friends in all these environments. And so again, it became de facto my first language. And as a result, I sort of wrote it, spoke it correctly. I mean, all the major episodes of my life, from wooing girlfriends to scribbling notes to classmates behind the teacher's back, were done in English. And inevitably, that was the English I speak. Now, I have no problem with the English of a Chetan Bhagat or whatever. Chetan is somebody whom I really value as a writer for what he has done to bring English language writing and make it accessible to a vast audience that people like me had never reached. But the truth is that I couldn't write like him without a very, very major effort, and I would probably fail. I would sound like a parody. He can do it effortlessly and naturally. And at the same time, he'd probably say he couldn't write like me either, because we are perhaps generationally also from
Yes.
different kinds of Indian English that we were living with and growing up with in India.
But do you think that, I wonder if therefore you think that the kind of English that you write, or the kind of English that I write for that matter, is therefore likely to sort of slowly die out as India evolves its own kind of English that is perhaps not standard English, or it's just a different,
No,
just as American English is different from.
Yeah, no, but no, I would disagree with that, Keshava, because you're implying that there would only be one kind of Indian English, and that's never going to be
which they
true.
won't, which is that's never going
No,
to be true.
I think that, you know, if you look at the very literate writings in the newspapers of a Ramchandra Guha or a Mukul Kesavan or half a dozen, you know, Karan Thapar. These are people who write this very literate English that you're talking about, and who have a readership and are respected for expressing their ideas in that form of English. But you'll also have a Chetan Bhagat, you'll also have a Shobha De, you'll also have people who write a very, what you might think of as a more demotic English, which is sort of the conversational English of the Bombay drawing room, which nonetheless has a certain relevance and appeal, and both will exist side by side, and there'll be versions in between. So I'm not troubled by the existence of multiple Indian Englishes, as it were.
Yeah. Although it's striking that all the names you mentioned who write in the more literary or traditional English are over 60. You know, there is a generational thing there. But I do think that your career illustrates that English is still a powerful literary language in India. I mean, you were an English first language politician who has been able to reach an audience nationally. And one of the unique, that remains the unique quality of English, that no state in India feels that English is specifically foreign to them. And as someone from the South, as a Tamilian, I mean, English doesn't have the frightening quality of Hindi imposition, or and it still is a language that unites India, even if it's spoken by only a few.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, especially when you go abroad, you see the usefulness of it, because when two Indians meet and they don't know exactly where each other is from, they instinctively will speak to each other in English first. And then if it turns out they have an Indian language in common, they might lapse into it. But English has been the linked language that has kept a certain educated segment of India's society united and in communication with each other. And that's why it's the language of national discourse, because, you know, you can't expect Rajagopalachari to function on an equal basis with Ambedkar and Rajendra Prasad in the Constituent Assembly if the discourse were taking place, let's say, in Hindi. In which Rajendra Prasad would have been fluent, Ambedkar would have been less so, and Rajaji would have been completely at a loss. So you know, you've got these genuine challenges in creating a pan-Indian sensibility and intellectual space, which actually English fills very comfortably.
Yeah, and Rajaji is a very interesting case, because he actually was a supporter of Hindi for most of his career, and then late in life realizes that it's not going to work and changes his mind. So I wanted to.
Well, he got clobbered when he tried to introduce it to Tamil Nadu.
That's right. Exactly. So, you know, since we're both cricket tragics, I also wanted to bring up that part of the book, because, you know, I think you're somebody who watches all forms of cricket, but the form that's celebrated in this book is Test cricket. It's, you know, the story you always tell of Buddhi Kundaran, the first Test match you went to, and the sort of the romantic era of Tiger Patowdy and all of that. I often wonder if cricket is certainly going to thrive, whether it's Test cricket, T20, T10. Cricket's not going anywhere. But I wonder if cricket writing is going to thrive in its old lyrical form if there isn't Test cricket, because the human drama of Test cricket lends itself to prose. And with T20 or short form cricket, I think the Shashi Tharoor style of cricket writer, I don't know how much space there is for that. I wonder, and you don't seem to be inspired to write about T20 from what I can see.
No, but it's also fair to say, I think, in all truth, that the quality of visual coverage of cricket has improved so much now that the need for evocative writing about a sport you can see for yourself on the television screen of this quality. Remember when I began watching cricket, you had these grainy black and white films division documentaries, which were the only way you could catch, and you could barely see what was happening. The cameras were far away, the picture images were blurred and grainy. It really was pathetic. And so you actually relished reading about those things that you couldn't actually see in the match. You heard about it on radio. Radio commentary was a very important way of feeding your imagination. And then, of course, you read good prose. I mean, there were some very, very fine cricket journalists when I was growing up, people like K.N. Prabhu and Rajan Bala and so on, who in Indian newspapers wrote some very, very evocative and vividly descriptive accounts of matches. And so graduating from that to reading books about cricket made perfect sense, and writing them made sense. I think today it'll be much less so, or at least the books will have to have a particular angle rather than be purely descriptive, because no description anymore can match the vivid quality of going on HD and seeing a catch in slow motion, or a dismissal, or the wicket cartwheeling out of the ground, or a batsman's sort of liquid grace in executing a cover drive or whatever. All of those things are there for your eyes to see. So writing about cricket will have to be different. It can't be the Neville Cardis or K.N. Prabhu Rajan Bala kind of writing anymore.
Yeah, the kinds of writing that I see ascended in cricket are statistical analysis, very sophisticated statistical and data analysis, looking at things like also sports science, things like that. And also, investigative journalism that examines cricket's links with politics and gambling and that sort of thing. So there's going to be a lot of room for that. I just think that there's, Sujit Mukherjee wrote a book called The Romance of Indian Cricket, and that's not about the Tiger Pataudi era. And I think that's not a phrase that comes easily to people's lips.
In the T20 era, there's no romance. It's sheer transactional sport.
Exactly. I wanted to talk a little bit at the time we have left. This is a great. This book covers all of the Shashi Tharoor, all the aspects of Shashi Tharoor, the writer, including the poet, which I actually didn't know about. That was one aspect I didn't know about. But my old teacher Neil Ferguson used to say that the ratio of words read to words written is very important. And in the blurb to the book, your publisher says that you've published over 5 million words. But you're obviously a reader even before you're a writer. Our current the paradoxical prime minister that we have is sometimes accused of being a writer rather than a reader. I don't think that's true of you. So how have your reading tastes evolved over time? Is reading something you stay able to make time for amidst everything else that you have to do?
It's a huge challenge, Keshava. I'm reading very much less than I read obviously as a teenager. I read extensively, largely because there were, in any case, no other distractions. As I said in my book, I think it was entertainment, escape, as well as erudition. But then when you come to today, I have very demanding work, and whenever I can carve out spare time for myself, it's divided between the computer, the television screen, and of course my own writing. So I read very much less. I would say on average, it wouldn't be much more than a book a month, or 1.3 books a month, or something like that. And a lot of it is done on flights, because that's the one time when I can literally shut myself off from the phone ringing, from people dropping in, or visitors, or intrusions of work, and I can focus on the printed word in front of me. So that is the reading. Now, how my tastes evolved, I read a lot more fiction as a young man than I do now. And it's not that my taste has evolved. I'm sure I enjoy fiction, just that given the urgent demands in my time, it seems more relevant to broaden my understanding of certain issues by reading a non-fiction account of something that matters to me in my current public life than to divert myself with a novel that might be elevating, that might be amusing, that might be diverting, but which will essentially have very little relevance to the day-to-day preoccupations of my work. And because the work, as you know, in political life is so all-encompassing, you tend to give that the priority. So I think I read very much more nonfiction now, including political books, recent history, that sort of thing. And I'm very conscious of treating myself to a novel, literally like a guilty indulgence. I finished a book I'd been holding for 3 years since it was published, Rushdie's Quixote, just last month, and that's probably the first novel as a novel that I've read in a very long time. But I know I take that back. I have read. I systematically set out this year to read a number of Malayalam novels that have been translated to English.
Yeah.
But that too, if you like, connects to me as a Malayali politician.
Yeah.
So I can't say that I haven't read too many novels. This year I've read 4 or 5 Malayalam novels in English.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you get the idea. It's still for me it's a pure indulgence. There's nothing in Rushdie's short that will relate to anything else I'm doing. But I want to read it because I enjoy his writing and I want to see what he had to say in his book. But for me, it's like a treat. I got to carry it along on a plane and make time for it and that sort of stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, and the thing with Malayalam novels in English is, or there are outstanding novels, but it's also you as a politician from Kerala, you also want to be in touch with what's going on in the culture, in the state. And I mean, in the book, you refer to a conversation you have with Mr. Modi, where you tell him that it's important to watch films because you have to know what the people of India are watching. So before we move on to some questions from the audience, 2 quick final questions. The first is, what role does P.G. Woodhouse play in your life today?
Well, sadly, not as much as I'd like. I'll tell you why. Because I finished everything the blessed man wrote by the time I was 19. And because there are so many books to read, I'm always guilty when I reread something. I've reread quite a few Woodhouses over the years, particularly during bouts of illness. Woodhouse always comes to rescue. But of late, the only Woodhouses I've allowed myself to have the pleasure of reading have been the handful of books written by new writers who have got permission from the Woodhouse estate to carry on the great man's characters. So most recently, a book called Jeeves and the King of Clubs, and I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten the author's name.
I think his name is Shott, Ben Shott.
That's Ben Shott, quite right, Ben Shott. And before that, there was a not very successful attempt by Sebastian Faulks, who's a better known writer. So I've read 2 or 3 of those, continuing the Woodhouse tradition. And that seems to be something that, I don't think anyone can exactly be like Woodhouse, but it sort of evokes some very pleasant memories when it does. Yeah.
And last question, I think this is more on behalf of your readers. Can you tell us what you might be writing next?
Well, actually, I can tell you what I am writing, or rather I'm researching in order to write, is a short biography of Dr. Ambedkar. It's partly a contribution to the 75th anniversary Tamashas, and it's partly because a British publisher, the Manchester University Press, wanted a short biography for a series they're doing on statesmen around the world, and so that gives me an opportunity. The 2 versions may be slightly different in that obviously I will have to assume certain things for Indian readership that won't be there for the British one, but I'm going to be doing a short book. I discovered with my Nehru book that you can actually say a lot more at shorter length than I have tended to assume was necessary. I mean, the Battle of Belonging started off as, in my mind, as a kind of 200-page book on nationalism, and ended up being closer to 500. And I do kick myself periodically that I get carried away with my own research and my own. I'm going to be very, very rigorous with myself on the Ambedkar book and try and keep it down to something short. And then once the Ambedkar book is done, I'm really going to try and resist every other request from publishers to write anything and go off and do a novel. It'll take me some time to write just to get back into the swing of it, because I haven't written fiction since Riot was published in 2001. So that's more than 20 years when I started. But I really want to go back to it because, as they used to say about a certain beer commercial, fiction reaches parts that other kinds of writing
that's right.
reach. And I really want to reach readers through those other parts.
That's right. So this is the Heineken approach to Heineken man. That's great. So we've got a bunch of questions from readers. You've just answered one, which is a few people wanted to know about when you're going to go back to writing fiction. So
I mean, the thing is, and I should say this, the reason I haven't so far is because of my work. It's just that, unlike nonfiction, fiction is not interruptible. With fiction, you have to create not only the time, but a space inside your head to invent an alternative universe and populate it with characters and incidents and lines of dialogue that are as real as those of the situations you encounter in your real life. And if you don't, and if that's interrupted, then the sort of palace of illusion you've constructed around you will get shattered. And when your glass palace shatters a few times, you simply can't rebuild it again. And so I tried in the first decade of the century to write fiction, and my laptops were littered with half-begun manuscripts. And then I said, no, I will not do this until I can actually be sure of having the time. And that will occur, I think, when the voters decide to return me to the world of literature.
Okay, so the first question comes, I was very struck by this question from Meher Sodhi. You have described wisdom as having permanent validity and yet perpetual irrelevance. Do you recognize having said that?
Sounds like something I might have said at some point, yeah.
Could you
I don't remember the context of when and where.
Could you explain this conundrum, she asked?
Okay, well, I think what I meant was, and I say I think because I genuinely don't remember the context, is that it was probably at some place I did find myself arguing the distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom, which is not a complicated thing to understand. But we are drowning in information. We have very little knowledge, but not all knowledge actually involves that combination of both facts and understanding that constitute wisdom. And so I would have said that wisdom, therefore, is more profound and more enduring because it involves both knowledge as well as understanding. At the same time, it's irrelevant because so few people, if you measure relevance in terms of applicability to vast percentages of a population, then wisdom actually strikes very, very few in any society, not just ours. So it's not a comment just about us, but about the world as a whole. Very many people wallow in information. Some do possess knowledge. Very few attain wisdom or are even interested in doing so. So that's what makes it irrelevant.
Question from Bibek. How come academia did not beckon you? After all, you did a PhD, or did it, and is it the road not taken?
Well, I actually, when I finished my PhD, I had three options before me. I was invited by an Indian newspaper to come back and work for them. I was invited by an American university to start teaching there as a lowly assistant professor. And I had an interview invitation from the United Nations. So I held off on signing the university offer until I'd seen what the UN possibility was like. And I decided on totally silly considerations. Number one, the pay was somewhat better at the UN. It wasn't great. I remember it now, 1978, it was $30,000 a year. But the second thing was I would have actually been posted, I was posted at the headquarters of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva, which was A, a city I'd never been to, and heard a lot about, B, in a part of the world I'd never lived in, namely Western Europe. And so I said, rather than teaching in snowy upstate New York, why not go off and discover a bit of the world for a year or two? And then I can go back to India and write for a newspaper or anything else. So that option's always available. So that's why I made the choice I made. But I'll tell you something, someone who does do an awful lot of lecturing, I'm keenly aware of the limitations of the teaching experience. And many of the academics I've come to respect do far better written work with occasional lectures than sort of repetitive, regular course room teaching in universities. And your own father, Guha, is a good example of that. So I think that, for me, I don't regret not having made that choice. The other thing about academics is I think when I was making that choice, there were no superstar academics. There was no way that academics were getting a mass audience. Academics weren't being published in the op-ed pages of newspapers. Academics weren't writing popularly read books. And so academics seem to be a limited and confined world than would be available to somebody in a more public space. Anyway, all of those considerations may have been the wrong ones, but I ended up with the choices I made. And you only have one life to live, so this is the life I ended up living.
And Geneva is presumably Geneva where you learned your French?
I had actually tried to teach myself French in India, and I even briefly took lessons from other attractive young teacher from Pondicherry who distracted me sufficiently that I don't think I learned very much French. But at the end of it all, I decided to enroll in the UN courses in Geneva, which were available to employees and diplomats. And I turned out to have a bit of a talent for the language, so I was able to skip a few grades, and I ended up finishing the entire UN 3-year course in a year and a half, and I got my certificate of professional fluency in French from the UN. So it's a français onusien, a French of the UN that I learned.
Yeah. And I think we don't have much time, so this might be the final question, but it's a good one, which is from Veer, which is, could you tell us some of the book or books you take with you to a desert island?
You know, I've asked this question more often than I ever expected to be. I would say that when people often ask you one book, I would say the Mahabharata, simply because it offers you so much.
So I'm going to interject on this. This question comes from the program Desert Island Discs, where you're given the Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare. So let's stipulate the Mahabharata stands in for the Bible, and it will give you your Shakespeare. So what else might you take?
Sorry, you froze when you were saying Mahabharata and what was the other one?
So let's give you the Mahabharata in lieu of the Bible from the original show, and you can have your Shakespeare. So what else might you take?
Oh, I would definitely take as many volumes of P.G. Woodhouse as I could hold in my hand, because I'm sure if I'm alone in a desert island, I'd need cheering up.
Yeah.
I would probably want Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which I read before he won the Nobel and made a profound impact on me. Even though I've never tried to write magic realism, I just found that the world he conjured and the way he did it, magnificent. And of course, it helps with the translation. It's so brilliantly done. I would probably. How many books are you giving me, Keshava?
As many as you like. Yeah.
Oh well, if you have a big steamer trunk full of books, I'd want to toss in Nehru's Discovery of India.
Yeah, of course.
I think that's that again offers rich pickings. A fat volume of wisdom. Probably they once published cricket scorecards and records.
Yes.
The copy I have ends in 1977 or 78. I think there was one more edition. And you know, you can keep looking back on old matches, including ones you've forgotten the details of, and that would offer endless hours of diversion. Assuming there is no internet on your desert island. And I would definitely want to take something for self-improvement. So there would have to be at least one serious spiritual work. If you've given me the Mahabharata already, I don't know, maybe Marcus Aurelius's contemplations, or one of those people who've thought more deeply about the meaning of life. Perhaps if there's a good translation of one of the Upanishads, that would be very well worth spending time on. And then I think certainly political reflections, not by politicians, but by a philosopher of some sort. Rawls's Theory of Justice, I'm not sure I want to reread, but that was very impressive. There must be something out there that I need to ask about before I'm stranded in that island. That will actually give me a lot to think about. Michael Sandel has been doing some interesting writing. Contemporary issues of what is just and equitable politics will be worth thinking about, always in the hope that I'll be rescued at the end and I will be able to apply something of what I've read. So if you give me a finite period, let's say if I'm stuck on that island for 6 months and I have that much worth of reading to do, that gives you a fair idea of the kind of range that I might go into.
Just to give the audience a sense of how different politics used to be, one of the people we mentioned earlier, former Home Minister of India and Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, Rajaji, actually translated Marcus Aurelius's Meditations into Tamil.
And the Mahabharata into English.
And the Mahabharata, exactly. So I think we're almost done. We're basically done. I have one final question, because I think that people do take what you say seriously, and so I want to give you a chance to amplify some writers, because you mentioned you were reading some books in Malayalam that have been translated to English. So are there any that you'd want people to? Are there names that people may not have heard of, writers that they should be aware of, that you've been reading recently?
So there's a lot of exciting writing happening, and there's also a lot of very well-established writers who are now available in rather good quality English translations. In the latter category comes a man like M. Mukundan, who actually has a novel on Delhi, written about the Malayali community in Delhi in the 60s and 70s, and published in Malayalam 10 years ago. It's just come out, just called Delhi, which I would strongly recommend. To people who don't know Malayalam, would like to know about this Malayali ethos. Both his literary sensibility as a writer, as well as the concerns and preoccupations of that community. There's a very interesting, adventurous poet novelist, Tachampo Rajivan, whose book has the rather odd title, The Man Who Learned to Fly But Could Not Land, which is kind of a fake biography, as it were, of a fictional character in the nationalist movement, and very, very interestingly done. There's the new novel, which I haven't finished yet, but I hope I will continue to enjoy, called Mustache by Harish, which was very controversial when he's one of the younger writers. There's another younger writer whom I've read and reviewed, and I'm suddenly having a senior moment and drawing a blank on his name, who writes very good satirical fiction. And there's the book is called The Cock is the Culprit, which very clever, very very intelligent allegory about a noisy cock in a village, and everyone wanting to put this rooster to death. But the name will come back in a minute. But look up the title; it's not difficult to remember. So there's all of these. These are some of the books I've read this year, and there are a lot more like that out there. And I'm intending to read more and more of them when time permits, because it's really quite an extraordinarily interesting intellectual ferment. I think Kerala and Bengal have had a long reputation for outstanding literature in their own languages, Malayalam and Bangla. Karnataka is catching up. I mean, Shanbag, of course, has now got international recognition. But from Anantamurthy to Shanbag, there's a lot happening in Kannada writing as well. And I would say that Tamil Nadu, with some of the new stuff, Bhama's books have just been getting a lot of international attention. There's a lot happening in Indian writing and Indian languages that I would urge our Anglophone attendees at the Tata Lit Live Festival to make a real effort to read, because the quality of translation is so much better than it used to be when I first read these attempted translations in the 1960s, that you will never feel that the translation is an impediment to your enjoyment of that work. So I would urge people to do a lot of that.
Well, that's the time we have. Thank you so much, Shashi.
Thank you, Keshava. Very wonderful.
And of course, I'm sure you'll all go out and get Shashi's book, but also perhaps some of the books that he's talked about and recommended here as well. And thanks to everyone for your questions also.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tharoor and Keshava Guha, for that delightful conversation, really. My reading list has now gotten bigger with the number of books and authors that you all have mentioned, and that's just amazing. That's exactly what we want to encourage. A big thanks to festival sponsors, Tata Steel, Tata Project, and also to Godrej for powering the fest, and session sponsors, Prime Securities. Don't forget, coming up tonight at 8 p.m., the Tata Literature Live 2021 Awards, the presentation of literary awards in fiction, non-fiction, and business categories. Very exciting indeed. I'm your MC Ratnavali Bhattacharjee, signing off for now. See you soon.